All right, let's get started. Today I'm going to talk a bit about mocking backend APIs with a tool called mock service workers, or MSW for short. What I will talk about is mocking backend responses in the browser. So making calls with fetch or what have you, as you normally do in a web frontend. And I will talk about mocking REST APIs. I will not talk about mocking stuff in Node. I might mention it though. I won't talk about mocking in React Native. Both of these are things that MSW can do, but I don't know how they work. I won't talk about mocking GraphQL APIs either, and that's also something mock service worker can do. And I won't go into that advanced patterns, but I will cover most of the use cases you might want to use it for. So why would I want to mock my backend then? The reason I mocked my the reason I started my first MSW project was that I was going back home, and to get back home I have a 3.5 hour ferry ride with unstable internet. So to continue be able to work, I had to mock my test backend. So I built a mocking tool for that and could code on the ferry. It also might be that you are working together with a backend team on some new functionality, either a completely new API or an updated version of an API where some content has changed. And to get away from the waterfall process of first backend develops it and pushes it out, and then the front end can get going, you can mock the all based off of an API specification file, for example. So you can get started on the front end developing before the backend is completed. And it could also be that you want to mock stuff to test your application. So instead of relying on a working test backend, you mock away that part and only test how your application reacts to different statuses or responses from the backend. I've used MSW for the first two, offline and new functionality, but haven't used testing. Haven't used it in testing environments, but it's a valid option. So how does mock service worker actually work? As you might figure out from the name, it uses a service worker. So here is the diagram of how the web works. You have a front end, and then you talk to a backend. What mock service worker does is it just injects itself in between with a service worker, intercepting all requests by, I think, adapting the fetch method in JavaScript, routes everything through its own service worker, and then spits back a response that you decide. And as we will see later, it can also be a proxy in between, so you can make the real calls. All calls will go through mock service worker, but you can choose which ones to react to. But enough of presentation. Now it's time to demo look at some code and some examples. So I've created a small test site here. Before we go into example 1, we will have a look on how to install mock service worker. And this code is in Next.js, but it works basically the same in React or Vue or whatever front-end framework you might use. So In this case, I'm checking that we're in the browser since Next.js is run both on the server and on the browser. I'm checking it. Do we have a window? Because if we do, we're in the browser. Then we import setup worker, which is a method from the MSW package. And then we call that with our handlers, which we will have a look at just in a moment. And then we say start the worker. This you would typically have guarded behind an environment variable like process and mock backend to be able to switch it on and off. Otherwise, you will be mocking everything, even in production, and you don't want that, I assume. Right, so now we've gotten our worker up and running. It feels like I should spend more time on this, but it's not it's not more complicated than this. Just start your worker and you're done. But let's go to example 1. So this is a React component in Next. I'm using MUI as a prototyping design component library. I will go through the component briefly now in the first example, and then all the other examples will look basically the same. So here I have some typography and a button, which when clicked will call the function fetch data. And fetch data is just a normal JavaScript fetch to this JSON placeholder API, which is a nice API that's online that you can just, if you just want something, it's great. And then I'm setting a React state based on the data, and if we have a data, I'm showing it on the site. So this looks like this then. We have our button. If we press the button, we will get a response from the backend. I will also bring up the dev tools. Let me know if something's too small or you can't see it. So if we have a look at the network tab, only fetches please, and fetch, we can see that we get stuff from the API, we make a call to this JSON placeholder, everything works fine. We can also see in the console when we started that MSW says that we're running. That means you've managed to start the worker perfectly. And you will also see here that it pushed out a console log that said capture the get/posts request. And what that comes from is the handler. So remember, when we started our worker, we gave it a lot of handlers, and these correspond to the examples in the test site. So if we have a look at example 1, here we have HTTP is the method from MSW that captures all requests. We say that all GET requests to this URL, and I've said specifically this one. You can use wildcards, you can use anything, so you could use capture everything. And then when it captures, it will console log this. But since this doesn't return anything, the request will be passed on to the real URL. The response will be returned, the real one. So here I've just sort of, when a request is made, console log this, but make the request as is. Right, let's move on to actually mocking stuff. So our example 2 works the same way. Now I'm fetching the second post since I want them to be unique. The handler for this example, I'm capturing all GET requests to this specific URL path, And then I'm returning an HTTP response.json with my file, or with my return body. So if we looked at, if it was real data, it would look like this. We have a user ID and title and so on. But when now we have mocked it, we will only get back this. And we will also get a log from MSW what happened. But if we look at our example code, this is production code. This is, we haven't changed anything in our actual business logic to be able to do this. We've just said mock this, and then our code works as expected as it would be in production. We've just mocked it on a second level. And this differs from, example, the great Bontouch tool, where you have to change URLs for the base path, for the API path, to be the Bontouch API, and then you can mock there. So this way you can keep your code as is while you're building it and abstract away your actual mocks. And in this way you will also have all your mocked responses in your code base, so version handled, etc., instead of having to go to Bontouch and add them. Don't get me wrong, Bontouch has its uses, but I really like having everything in the same place. And feel free to ask questions at any time if it comes up. So that was mocking an entire response. Oh right, we can also have a look at the network tab for that. If we can find it. It was we did a fetch for the second API, and if we look here, can we expand this? The request URL is this JSON placeholder typecode posts /2, which we know if we go to it returns. Wait, is it 1? Oh, whatever. It's weird. But we see that your response is our mocked response. So to the browser, it's just, yeah, this is a real response from the real server. So everything is from the network layer. Our code is behaving exactly as it would. Right. We can also specify parameters in our mocks. So if we go to our example 3, as you saw, we have 2 buttons. Was it example 2? No, example, oh right, yeah. We have 2 buttons, and they will fetch depending on an ID. So it will fetch to-dos /3 or to-dos /6. And in our handler, we've added :ID as a sort of generic parameter in the URL path. And that parameter sorry, is then available to us in the params object passed to this function. So here we take in params, which is our ID, and we build our response based on that. Our ID here will be the passed in ID. So if we press fetch to 3, we can see that we caught the 3 in the parameter and returned 3 as an ID, and the same with 6. And this specific example is you know, a very basic ones. Here you can imagine building very much sort of copying the backend logic to return different stuff based on the parameters. Next one is adding headers sometimes your backend will return different headers based on different scenarios. It might be a header specifying a trace ID in your backend logging, or basically anything. With MSW, you can also do that. And I apologize for my voice apparently shutting down. We'll see if I last. Right, example 4. Previously, we've done, I'll put them up side to side so you can compare them. So in our previous example, we returned HTTP response.json. And that's sort of a shorthand method to send a JSON response. It will set the content type header to application JSON. It will calculate the correct content length, etc. But you can build up a complete HTTP response from scratch with everything that HTTP response in HTML/JavaScript supports. So here we can see that we, as a body for the response, we send back a simple object, which we have stringified because that's how you return stuff in a body. And then we've set a couple of headers here. We've set a custom header. We've set the content type, since we're not getting that for free. And we've also set the content length to sort of the length of that. And when we run this, we can see that the response is printed. And if we look in our headers in our network tab, we will see we have our custom header added to the response. Example 5. We can also change the status, because how much we want to code only for the happy path stuff isn't always happy. So, for example, we can be unauthorized to get a resource, and in the same way as before, we make a complete HTTP response. We send back the text unauthorized. We set the status to 401, and we set the content type to text plain. So when we run this, we will see we won't get any results because the network call failed. The fetch failed because we got back here. We can see, oh, we got back a 401 here with the response unauthorized. Perfect. And you can use any status here that you want. What is it? 416? Is that a teapot? Can you use that? Sometimes when you make a call, the backend might be completely down, so you won't get a response at all. And that way you can, if I press this button, the fetch method, the call will encounter a network error and throw that. So as soon as I press this button, the application will crash because I haven't done my error handling correctly. So here we can see that, oh, failed to fetch. The fetch method just crashed. And can we see that anyway? Wait, where did that go? I think it might be that one. Ah, we get a network error. Let's look at the code instead. Handlers 6. And here also mock service worker gives us a handy just .error method to simulate backend being down, the user being offline, then fetch would throw network errors. So it's a nice way to test how your application works in those scenarios. Right, let's refresh this to get the error away. We can also extend a response. As I said in the beginning, you can use mocking of backend to sort of adapt the backend to a coming change. So you want the full data, but you want to add something to it. So here we have real data, which is fetching a user in this case. It has a lot of data regarding the user. Let's look at the last one. It's company. Remember that. So say we, together with the backend team, has agreed that, okay, we need another property in our user's endpoint. We need the property new property, which should be a string. Then we can, in this case, we say that all GET requests to, in this case, this user, create a URL based on the request URL. This button, or sorry, this line reads query parameters. So let's perhaps start by looking at the component code. The original data makes a call to our URL and adds a query parameter, pass through true. And this is I made that up, you can use whatever. And the mocked button makes a fetch without that. So the handler looks, is that pass through query parameter there? Then return pass through, which is make the call as it would be made if it wasn't mocked, and then it returns. So we do an early return if we have that. And that's just a way for me to show you the same response, but with one being mocked. I hope that makes sense. So this pass-through method from MSW is just do the request as you would normally. But in our mocked path of this, our real use, we do a fetch to bypass request, and bypass is another mock service worker function. And what this does, it makes a request but ignore any handlers, just make the request for real. So because this fetch would otherwise trigger itself again and you would be in a sort of infinite loop. So this bypass it, do the fetch but skip mock service worker, and then we get the response. So this real user is the real response. We have actually made a fetch here, and then we can return HTTP response JSON, our real user, but with a new property. So if we fetch data, the second one here, we can see that we've expanded our backend response with our new data. So here we can leverage the real testing backend or real backend, but mock only the parts that hasn't been built by the backend yet. That makes it much easier to mock, for example, because then you don't have to have all this in your mock files. You can just rely on the real data. Right, and our last example is delays, because backends aren't instant, at least not the ones I've worked with. So you can use the function delay from MSW, which is add a random delay simulating a real backend. So if we clear this and fetch with a default delay, and oh god, try to. Has anyone figured out how to expand the columns in Chrome reliably? I've never. It's black magic. But here we can see the time, and if we do a few of them, you can see that it seems to vary between 100 and 400 milliseconds. It looks like. So it's adding a random delay. But you can also add a manual delay. Like, okay, this is really slow. what happens then? And then you can see, okay, 3 seconds. So here you can perhaps, what happens if the backend doesn't respond for over 30 seconds? Do we time out before that, and so on? You can mock that and test that. Let me just have a brief look at my notes to see if I have forgotten anything. Oh yeah, right. So if we go back to where we set up a worker, you might have seen this options property here, on unhandled request bypass. So if we don't have that, because that's not the default value, and we go back to this, we can see, can we see that? Can we see that somewhere? Console, oh boy, let's refresh. Here, we can see that mock service worker will print a bunch of warnings to our console saying, oh, mock service worker intercepted a request for this favicon. And since this specific one will only be seen in local development development environment, because it's the hot module reloading stuff in React that makes fetch calls to these instead of normal calls. So files wouldn't be, it would only be fetches that would show up for real. But as you can see, a lot of requests are intercepted but not handled. And the warning is here for us to know that, oh, you might have forgotten to mock something. There are still real calls being made. But when developing, I often don't care about that. So, oh, come on. So then I usually go with bypass, which is just ignore them. And these are the options. Warn is the default one. You can also say error. And that is, I very much would not like any calls to be made. And then it will throw errors all over the case and prevent those calls from being made. Which might be good if you are experimenting with a backend that you're not allowed to call. I don't know. But the option is there. If you want to have a hard wall behind your code, you can put it to error. But mostly I would recommend bypass. But put it on warn if you're experienced that your mocks might not work, then put warn and see what happens. What to do? Right, and that's basically it for mock service workers. It's a very neat tool, and it's very simple to use, and it can give you a working backend environment where you might work with a backend team that's slow. So thank you. Any questions?
Out of curiosity. Oh, sorry. Go,
Oh,
Bruno.
sorry. No, you can go first.
I was just curious. Do you usually have this setup, kind of, even though your project might not have it? Do you usually have some sort of setup for this ready to go? Yeah, at any time, or how do you use this?
No, I use it on a per project basis. So if I identify, okay, this project would need a mocked backend, then I would just plonk this in, because since the setup is so easy, you just have to add a start worker, and writing handlers will always be very specific for your use case. There's no point of having a generic one ready. I mean, it's always sort of ready to go.
So you don't have
There
a
is,
Gotland ferry environment variable that you set as soon as you go to the
No.
ferry?
No,
Okay.
I do not. And it actually has quite okay Wi-Fi nowadays, but a couple of years ago it didn't. But what was I going to say? Oh yeah, there's a community built tool as well to create handlers automatically from either a Swagger file or a HAR network traffic file. So you can just do it in a real environment or based on a specification and then create this automatically. And that looked quite nice. I haven't done that for real. I've just experimented with it. Bruno.
Yeah, so I was just wondering a bit about the first example, actually. The handler.
Or the first real one.
No, this one. So, are these handlers only used for, or would you only use it for the mocked response, or can you use them for all fetches?
Yeah, you can use them for all. A use case that I didn't mention, but that MSW does mention in their code is sort of doing this. Capturing all requests and that or something. To sort of inspect all your fetches if you want to catch all requests, but not still make them go through, but want to push to a log endpoint or do some kind of performance measurement on all requests perhaps. And that you could do, that you can ship in production as well if that's needed. This would just extend everything. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I think so. I was just thinking about the project, one of the projects I made now, Mitt Vaccine. So in that project, we need to define a mocked response for all the endpoints. So I guess in this case, we would, when we define the service worker in the app, the setup file, we would need to pass in we would need a handler for every endpoint, basically, is my understanding.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, you wouldn't split them up one handler per file.
No,
you
exactly.
would. Right. I mean, these are arrays, so you would do your next one. It'd be post to whatever, and then you would probably returning. If we look at this one you could probably import from a fixture file somewhere to make it a bit neater as well. That was what I would do. So I would have my actual response data somewhere in another file for clarity, because otherwise this will be a bunch of JSON that's just fake data.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions? Cool. Let me know if you end up using it. I really enjoy using it, and I think it serves a purpose.
I'm gonna try it out straight after this. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for listening.